Hey strangers, there's one thing we know for sure as business owners ourselves. The less your business spends, the more margin you keep. But today, everything costs more. So, smart businesses are graduating to NetSuite by Oracle. NetSuite is the #1 cloud financial system, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one proven platform, helping you reduce IT costs, maintenance costs, and manual errors. Over 37,000 companies have already made the move to NetSuite. Backed by popular demand, NetSuite has extended its one-of-a-kind flexible financing program for a few more weeks. Head to netsuite.com/strange. netsuite.com/strange.
Hey, true crime fans! Tired of ads interrupting your gripping investigations? Good news. With Amazon Music, you have access to the largest catalog of ad-free top podcasts included with your Prime membership. After all, ads shouldn't be the scariest thing about true crime. To start listening, download the Amazon Music app for free or go to amazon.com/ad-free-true-crime. That's amazon.com/ad-free-true-crime to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
This episode opens with a discussion of the colonial American witch trials, so it's a little grim. Listener discretion is advised for our youngest strangers. I'm Laurah Norton, and this is One Strange Thing, the show where we search the nation's news archives for stories that can't quite be explained. Strangers, we've told you about a witch or two over the past 100 or so episodes. In fact, if you're a premium subscriber, you've just heard a very interesting tale about a curse. But rarely have we run into a story quite like this one. But before we can get into the rather charming legend of a woman who was known, probably, as Hannah Cranna, we need to talk about something markedly less pleasant: witch trials. Now, when you think of New England and the persecution of witches, which, let's be honest, likely involved very few practitioners of anything besides medicine or not being very popular, the usual Puritan crimes, Salem, Massachusetts has got to be the town that comes to mind. And that is fair, though there are misunderstandings big enough that there's now a cottage industry of "you didn't burn my witch grandma" t-shirts out there. That's not how things actually went down. In what would become the United States, witches were executed by other methods, not that they were any less lethal. Per pin today, the Salem witch trials lasted just 1 year. With 200 accusations and 45 executions, you'd be forgiven for thinking that things went on for much longer. What's much less known, though, was that America's witch panic didn't start in Salem. It was another colony, Connecticut, that kicked off a particularly dark time in American history. We've seen varying reports of the precise number of accusations and the years the trials took place. But if we go with the Connecticut General Assembly's research, here is a very broad overview. The colony's witch trials, quote, were held in the mid to late 1600s, between 1647 and 1697. The Assembly's research team found the names of 46 people who were accused during this period. Of the accused, 8 were definitely executed, and 3 more were, quote, likely executed. The records were not definite. Per the Assembly, no deaths occurred after 1662, though the trials, including at least one instance of the dreaded water test, certainly continued. If you're not familiar with that absolutely illogical approach to identifying witches, if one is submerged in water and survives, they're a witch. If they drown, then they're innocent of witchcraft. But also, they've now been drowned. You can see the intrinsic issues with that approach. So, though the Connecticut witch trials were smaller in scale in terms of accusations and ultimately deaths, they lasted for decades longer than those in Massachusetts. Puritan culture has deep roots in New England. The region's last official witch trial, which, oddly, was a civil suit, was tried in 1878. Per Historic Ipswich, the charges were brought against a Mr. Daniel Spofford of New Hampshire. He certainly wasn't the first man accused of witchcraft in America, but he might have been the only one charged with first healing a woman's spinal injury through mesmerism and then causing her to relapse through some kind of psychic injury. In any case, Mr. Spofford was a good sight luckier than the accused who'd preceded him in the centuries before. He didn't even show up to his court date, and still, the judge dismissed the charges. Still, a fear of witchcraft threaded through the Puritan-established former colonies for many decades, well into their transformation into the United States. In fact, that's one reason why we find the following story, well, so strange. It's a local legend from Monroe in the southwestern corner of Connecticut. If you're from those parts, you might be familiar with the tale that we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, the doings of a purported witch called Hannah Cranna, and how she ran circles, magically speaking, around the folk that she lived among. And, if those tales are to be believed, they didn't hold a single trial. Now, we need to begin with quite a grain of salt. Many grains, if you please. Enough grains of salt to keep Dean and Sam safe for an entire season of Supernatural. Because this is a story that's really a legend. We'll tell you that first, and then we'll get into the inconvenient world of fact-checking. The first telling of Hannah Cranna's tale, as far as we can find, comes from a series of articles published in the Newtown Bee back in December of 1900. Articles is probably a stretch. It's more of a 3-part piece of entertainment. But according to the installments, the anonymous journalist is presenting locals with a story from their not-so-distant past. Per the Bee's first article, the story was a famous one in the area of Monroe, or a little village tucked within it to be precise. There, Hannah Cranna was a legend. She'd lived in the area of Stepney on what the author described as the summit of a hill. There, the paper claimed, the ruins of her home could still be seen. Quote, "The history of the old place is well known to the grandsires and the grandames of the village, but few of the younger generations have aught but a hazy idea of its past or of its occupant at the time of which I write. Many years ago, so many that only 1 or 2 of its oldest inhabitants now living ever saw her. In the house on the hill lived Hannah Cranna, a woman whose powers of witchcraft were known by all and feared by many of the denizens of the countryside. To this day, her name is spoken in awestruck accents by such of the villagers as are conversant with her history, and from the day of her death, or perhaps I should say her disappearance from earth to the present time, not one of them has ever ventured, after nightfall, on the unused road leading past her old home." Pretty good opening, right? The Newtown Bee also sprinkles in real, contemporary, to 1900, people and places throughout the story, tying in the sites of various events to places where modern locals lived or local families to that tale. So, apparently, Hannah Cranna's career in witchcraft started with a homicide. Her husband, Silas Cranna, was a total reprobate. The Bee actually calls him a tippler, which is an adorable way of saying that he drank a lot. And it seems that Hannah, she didn't like that. So, per the Bee, quote, "She ushered in her initiation to witchcraft by murdering him in a startling, novel, and sensational manner." That means, strangers, that she pushed Silas right off a handy cliff. No magic needed, but that was somehow the start. And Hannah's cliffside excursion was also widely known, or at least suspected in town. And yet, no one was keen to bring her up on any charges, because she apparently went about her business. And that business was disappearing for half a year or so, only to reappear and begin what we can honestly call an extended period of witchery and neighborly harassment. Strangers, we do need to pause for a moment and mention that other more modern sources claim that Hannah was actually the wife of a man named Captain Joseph Hovey, And we're talking about several sources here, from blogs to books like Legendary Connecticut. Poor Silas, he totally disappears from those narratives. But in either case, the husband in the story goes right over that cliff, and the witch, she's still known as Hannah Cranna. And to explain the Cranna name in the Hovey version, well, opinions vary, but the New England Ghoul claims that, quote, Hannah picked up the name Hannah Cranna soon after, Cranna being Scottish for a rocky place. So, in their version, she was nicknamed for the cliff that she pushed her husband off of, which is, dark. We'll get back to that whole husband issue later. Right now, though, Hannah and the town are the most important. Because, really, that does seem like an odd situation. The Newtown Bee paints Hannah as old when this all began. So it's even more interesting that the townsfolk put up with her behavior. A murder, and then witchcraft. Isn't it odd considering that they lived in Connecticut, a place that had its own colonial witch panic? Based on the paper's promise that a few who knew her were still living at the time of publication, she would have been alive sometime in the mid-19th century. Not prime witch trial time, to be sure, but murder? Now, that's a charge that had not gone out of fashion. And yet, no one did a thing. Perhaps it was because they were frightened, but that hadn't stopped Connecticut in centuries past, had it? Honestly, we can't explain it. This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Whether you love true crime or comedy, celebrity interviews or news, you call the shots on what's in your podcast queue. And guess what? Now you can call them on your auto insurance too with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive. It works just the way it sounds. You tell Progressive how much you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll show you coverage options that fit your budget. Get your quote today at Progressive.com to join the over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
علي الحماس مع منيو بيتزا هات ماي بوكس الجديد. 4 خيارات ماي بوكس تعدلها على كيفك وزيد عليها اختيارات ما لها حدود. اطلب ماي بوكس اليوم وخليها على ذوقك. بيتزا أو ملت كله بكيفك. وطلباتك الجانبية اختر 2 أو مشروب. خياراتك ما تنتهي. هي شروطك وأحكامك اللي ترضي ذوقك. منيو بيتزا هات ماي بوكس الجديد بشروطك وأحكامك. بيتزا هات اطلب اليوم.
So, on to Hannah's reign of, well, not terror exactly, but agricultural malfeasance at the very least, which began about 5 months after the apparent murder of her husband. You'll remember that, per the Newtown Bee, she retreated from town life for about half a year after that dramatic event. And when she was next seen, she'd apparently gained magic abilities. There was that, and the fact that she was hanging around with a black rooster named Old Boreas that crowed only at midnight, and a gray cat, Grimalkin, who followed her wherever she went. Honestly, we have no notes here. Those are high-quality, familiar monikers. After her reappearance, she set out showing off her powers in what we consider to be a particularly petty fashion. A farmer's cow got into her flowers, so she cursed his potato crop, as one does. And indeed, his potatoes shriveled and died. It was only when he went and offered sincere apologies and money that she relented. She promised him a good corn crop, we guessed the potatoes were done for at this point, and told him to go out at night to his fields to see the proof. And, indeed, he there saw the plants growing before his very eyes. The witch appeared amongst the stalks, and, per the bee, cried, "Always remember that as others do to me, even so I do to them. Good for good and evil for evil." A major component of Hannah's magic was devoted to punishing men who rode by her house and irritated her. A time-honored tradition among witches, really. She made bags of grain fall off the backs of horses. She cursed the woods around her home so no animals could be shot. She hexed the creek so fish couldn't be caught. Truly, she was a menace. Although it was not mentioned in the Newtown Bee, the book Legendary Connecticut claims that Hannah quickly developed a reputation for, quote, cursing neighbors who failed to keep her well supplied with food, and that once she turned on a woman who offered her a pie that was too small for her liking. The result was that that woman was never able to bake a decent pastry again. It wasn't all bad, though. It's claimed that the witch brought rain to the village after a drought. Both Legendary Connecticut and the Newtown Bee agree on that, but the former claims that it came at the cost of a local farmer's soul. In the paper's version, everyone just asked very nicely, and for that farmer's sake, we hope that politeness was actually enough. Now, the town put up with all this magic for a long time and seemed to believe in her powers. So what happened at the time of Hannah Cranna's death strikes us as particularly odd. According to the Newtown Bee, she knew that her time was coming. Her passing was signaled first by the death of her rooster, old Boreas. After one last midnight serenade, he expired in her garden. And then her cat Grimalkin, well, he walked up and also died, right on the same spot. Apparently, this was all a sign for Hannah, who went down to the village and gave the town leaders a series of explicit instructions. Per Legendary Connecticut, she said that the coffin must be carried down from her home by human hands and not any conveyance, and that I must not be buried before sundown. Well, strangers, you'd think that they would listen after all of those curses. But no, they did not. You see, it was winter when she passed away, and it was snowing a lot, and Hannah's house was high up on a hill. Not a convenient time to move a coffin by hand at nighttime, right? So, quote, the mourners strapped her onto a sturdy horse-drawn sled. But as the sled pulled away from her house and started up the hill to the graveyard, the straps must have somehow come loose, for, lo and behold, the casket fell off the rear of the sled and slid all the way down to her doorstep. This kept happening over and over until they gave up and finally followed her wishes. But apparently, that was not enough to satisfy Hannah's disgruntled ghost. Because, per the Newtown Bee, Hannah's house, and just her house, caught fire that very night. When the villagers rushed to extinguish the flames, they found that the town well had gone completely dry. And strangers, it stayed that way, perhaps as a way of expressing her ongoing displeasure. They helplessly watched the fire burn until the house was completely gone. Some said they even saw her spirit moving about in the blaze, and her ghostly rooster perched on a nearby branch. A pretty good legend, right? And, like we said, the Newtown Bee's version is sprinkled with references to real people and real places that tie Hannah's story to the town. There's just one tiny problem with it all. We can't verify either version, the Bee's or the one told in Connecticut legends, in any historical records. Now, various blogs and books offer different time ranges for Hannah's birth and death that don't line up with the Newtown Bee. But even accounting for that, we still cannot find a single person who could conceivably be Hannah, married to a Silas or a Captain Joseph Hovey in Connecticut in the 19th century, or in any century actually. And there's no record of a Silas Cranna at all. Now, there are a lot of Hoveys who lived and died in that area, including a Joseph Hovey or two, and even a few who were in the military. And there was a Captain James Hovey who married a Hannah Tomlinson, though they lived before the supposed time in question. But none of the actual bits and pieces as presented in the sources line up, not place or time or names. All in all, it would seem like a total invention by the Newtown Bee that was then reimagined by others and retold and reshaped and put into books. Or it might. except for one strange thing. There is another kind of proof, a very concrete form if you'll excuse the pun, and we have no explanation for it. There's a little cemetery called Gregory Four Corners Burial Ground in Fairfield County, where Monroe is located. And there sits a stone marker for a grave that reads, Hannah Cranna, wife of Captain Joseph Hovey, 1783 to 1859-60. It is an odd inscription, with that death year so variable, and many have noted how clear the stone's etching is in comparison to others in the same burial ground. But despite a total lack of records to back up any such marriage or any such person, or any explanation as to why the name Cranna would be there too, there it stands. What do we make of this? Honestly, strangers, we have no idea. As the Brombones book blog points out, it seems odd to put a nickname on a gravestone, especially one that would seem so dark if it did indeed come from Hannah Cranna killing her husband. But without any record of a Cranna family in the area, we don't have other ideas. Of course, record keeping isn't perfect, and we can't access everything, but it's still a strange little mystery. Where on earth did the Newtown Bee get the character of Silas, if all the while there was this stone perched over at the burial ground? Who was Captain Joseph Hovey? Was this Hannah ever really considered a witch, or did the story form years later, as so many do? Did that rooster really exist? We really hope so, because Old Boreas, that is an inspired name for a chicken. That is the thing about legends. You go looking for proof, and when you find something, well, it often increases the mystery, doesn't it? And that, strangers, is one of our favorite kinds of mysteries. We do like to land ourselves right back into uncertainty. It's kind of our natural habitat. We hope you'll join us next time for another real-life story from the fine print of America's local papers. From the lives of regular people, just like you and me, except for one strange thing. Strangers, I've released my first book, and it's available everywhere now as audiobook, hardcover, and ebook. I read the audio version myself. It's called Lay Them to Rest, and it's about John and Jane Doe's, my years-long experience following forensic experts around the country, and our efforts to solve the mysteries of a cold case. One Strange Thing is an independent production. To support the show and to hear more of the entirely true and enticingly peculiar, you now have 3 options to enjoy 2 extra bonus episodes a month. On Apple Premium and Supercast, you can get the bonus episodes delivered to your app of choice for just $2.99. And for $2 more a month on Patreon, you'll get more fun extras. There you'll find ad-free early releases of our regular episodes, 2 full-length bonus episodes, monthly giveaways, blog posts, and the occasional live stream, all for $5 a month. We hope you'll check out one of these options and support the show. There's a link in our show notes. And if you enjoy One Strange Thing, please take a moment to leave us a great rating or review on your favorite podcast app. It really helps.